They did it! Starship takes to the skies once more and SpaceX catches a super heavy booster. My name is Felix, welcome to What About It? Let's go for launch. Starship updates. What a week! After 4 long months of waiting, it's finally happened again. Starship, the largest, most advanced rocket ever built, has once again taken to the skies. Under the force of its 33 Raptor engines producing a mind-boggling 17 million pounds of thrust, enough to propel this 5,500-ton monster to space with ease. We'll get to that in a moment. However, SpaceX still had a few things to do before they could launch, as the last time we left this ship and booster, they were still in 2 separate pieces. That was until the afternoon of the 11th, when Ship 30, having now received its flight termination system, was placed for the final time between the arms of the launch tower and lifted into the air before being placed on top of Booster 12. But before SpaceX could launch this pair, they needed one last thing: a launch license. After over a month of the FAA insisting Starship wouldn't be able to get this license until late November, things seemed final. Until just a week ago, when SpaceX announced that they would be flying in just a few days. After this announcement, the FAA seemed awfully quiet, but thanks to some of our inside sources, we knew that this was in fact the case and that the permit had been fast-tracked. Possibly by another agency that may have some uses for Starship, such as the Department of Defense or NASA. However, even with that, the FAA still needed a bit of time to get the permit ready, and then as we all held our breaths for the last missing piece before a flight, they got it. They received the license less than a day before the flight was scheduled on the afternoon of the 12th. And on the morning of the 13th, at about 6:30 local time, fueling began on the ship just 50 minutes before T-0, which was now set to 7:25 near the end of the launch window. We were ready, with cameras all over the launch site and even in the air, to catch this historic-making flight. Huge thanks to Redline Helicopter Tours for providing us with the needed lift for one of the cameras. As the clock approached 0, the vehicle and the ground hardware came to life, and clouds of condensation billowed off the gigantic cryogenic tanks of the now fully fueled vehicle. At T-2 minutes and 50 seconds, the propellant load was completed, giving the rocket the energy needed to perform what came next. The countdown then continued until about T-40 seconds. I was streaming this live with around 50,000 spaceflight fans. We all held our breath to see if all conditions were clear. The T-40 second mark is important because Starship has the ability to hold here for an extended amount of time before launching. There had been some range violations not long before, and given that this was already 25 minutes into a 30-minute launch window, that would have ended the launch and pushed it by 48 hours. I got info from a trusted source that shrimp boats caused this delay. Hope they had luck catching something. SpaceX sure did. Then, just 10 seconds later, we heard it.
Flight directors go for launch.
And then the real countdown began. At T-10 seconds, the water-cooled steel plate began to erupt with a tsunami of water to protect itself from the flames that were about to happen. And then, 3, 2, 1, liftoff. Starship is flying yet again, and unlike during the last flight, it was under the power of all 33 engines. We watched from all angles as this gigantic vehicle rose into the air, eventually becoming no more than a speck from the ground. Then just 2.5 minutes after liftoff, this booster had done its job of lifting the gigantic Starship upper stage into space so that it could complete its journey around the globe. That's why we saw all but the center 3 Raptor engines shut off at MECO. That's the reason why SpaceX calls it most engines cut off. Then, after a very long 8 seconds, the ship lit its engines to say farewell to its partner for the last time. This is where the story of the booster would end for almost any other rocket. It would be discarded, thrown into the ocean, and forgotten in the history books. But this isn't just any other rocket booster, and this time SpaceX wanted to get the booster back. Just after it said goodbye to the upper stage, it fired up its maneuvering thrusters and flipped around before relighting its middle ring of 10 engines and aiming straight for the launch pad. SpaceX decided to take this flip a little slower than previous ones, opting to ignite the engines after 7 seconds following hot staging instead of the 4 it waited on previous flights. Fortunately, it seems SpaceX has moved past most of the sloshing problems because, unlike on Flight 2, this booster was able to successfully light all of its engines for the boost back burn while staying in one piece. Its engines then burned for almost a minute, with the shutdown happening at 3 minutes and 41 seconds. Then, just like on Flight 4, the hot staging ring was jettisoned to save weight and avoid possible aerodynamic issues such as those seen on Flight 3. Fortunately, SpaceX has confirmed this is only a temporary solution until the later Block 2 boosters, but for now, at least, we can get a good view of the top of the booster as we watch all of the delicate instruments guide the booster in for a landing. This part is likely the most important, as now the teams on the ground and the booster's internal computer need to make a difficult choice. Do they keep the booster on its current trajectory and splash down in the water? Or do they guide the gigantic explosive-filled soda can into the chopsticks for a catch, risking the entire launch site in the process? And then we heard the call out we were all waiting for. At just under 4.5 minutes into the flight, we got the confirmation they were going for a landing. They were actually going to do this. To accomplish this, the booster uses its body to provide just enough lift to glide to the launch site. This ensures that if there are any problems, the booster will fall short and safely splash down into the water. As the booster was guiding itself in, we also got a quick cameo from the hot staging ring. It appeared to be fairly close to the booster as it followed a similar trajectory. However, unlike the booster, it would splash down in the ocean. Watching this live was incredible, and it is still difficult for me to comprehend what happened next. As the booster began pointing toward the launch site, we got some incredible views from the ground, including this shot from SpaceX that shows just how hot this booster gets on re-entry. Unlike the Falcon 9, which lights its engines during its return to slow it down and protect itself from some of the extremely high temperatures, Super Heavy just goes straight for it. Bam! SpaceX designed the engines and booster to withstand those high temperatures easily. However, they had some heating issues on the way down, which we will discuss a bit later. As the booster's altitude continued to drop, its speed did as well, until it was just a kilometer above the pad when it relit all 13 of its inner engines. Unlike the previous flight, all 13 engines lit with very few problems. Except it still wasn't quite perfect, as shortly after the engines reignited, small pieces of debris could be seen flying away from the booster. This came from its chines, which act as protective housings for equipment such as COPVs, which are needed to relight the engines. Fortunately, all the engines were already lit, so if there was a problem here, it shouldn't have been an issue. It also appears that it may have just been the housing that was damaged and all of the internal equipment stayed intact. There did also appear to be substantial flames coming from the booster and not from the engines. Thanks to our photographers on the ground and in the air, we were able to see that the booster quick disconnect had begun breathing fire. Whew. So we held our breath as all we could do was stop and wait to see what happened next as the middle ring of 10 engines cut off. The booster was now under the power of just its Center 3 Raptor engines, with its speed rapidly dropping. The booster's trajectory targeted just away from the launch tower, so if there were any problems it would crash into the ground instead of into the equipment. That's why the booster began to shift itself rapidly toward the tower. Whew. Its horizontal velocity was much greater than anything we've seen, such as on a Falcon 9 landing, and is more comparable to the early SN Hopper flights. The booster rapidly corrected in the opposite direction to cancel out all of its horizontal velocity, and the flames were pointed almost directly into the tower. Mechazilla felt the full breadth of this rocket. The engines appeared to get just meters away from the tower as it gently glided down, canceling as much of its velocity as possible. The chopsticks then rapidly closed in around it, and then something happened that will revolutionize spaceflight from here on. They did it! What in the world did we just watch? We just hit 500,000 subscribers. Help us improve the channel even further by double checking that you've hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our updates. And while you're at it, give us a like and become a wise supporter. Why? Because you'll gain access to a massive amount of extra content. With it, you get access to daily new Starbase photo galleries, including all those we've posted so far. Satellite, aerial and ground photos, more than 400 posts in the past 2 years alone, with up to 7 picture galleries per week, insights, chats with me, you name it. Thank you so much, you rock. As the booster came down, the water deluge system once again activated, flooding the launch pad with a protective layer of water as the booster's flames quickly began to engulf it. It slowed itself down to a complete stop, with the shock absorbers taking any extra force as my wife prepared to perform CPR on me after having a heart attack from watching this all happen. SpaceX successfully caught history's most powerful rocket booster out of mid-air with a gigantic pair of metal chopsticks. First try. I think it's impossible to overstate how revolutionary this event was. It was like watching the moon landing. SpaceX now holds the title of being the company to develop the first and second propulsively landing orbital class rocket boosters worldwide. One of those also holds the title of being the world's most powerful rocket booster. This will truly change everything. Although things weren't quite done yet, as Booster 12 still had a slight flame at the bottom, and given some past experiences during what seemed to be successful landings, we know that this booster still had one last hurdle to overcome. It appears that the booster quick disconnect was either venting on purpose or had sprung a leak, billowing out fuel that was instantly burning. Fortunately, the booster either ran out of fuel or SpaceX was able to close the valve as the flames slowly went out. And there it was, Booster 12 had made it back in one piece. As we were still catching our breaths from this incredible achievement, SpaceX wasted no time moving forward. Rapid reusability. Musk also stated in response to some close-up images of the engines that some of the outer engine nozzles were bent from the heat and forces of the landing, but fortunately he stated that this was an easy fix. The question now is, are we looking at the Flight 6 booster? Very likely not, but it is incredible to think that in just 5 short flights we can already begin thinking of booster reflights. Truly revolutionary. What a landing! But the fun was still only getting started, because while the booster was returning to the pad, ship 30 was getting even further from it as it prepared for re-entry. What a week it's been with Starship and Hurricane Milton rolling over the Space Coast. It's been a wild ride, and luckily we've stayed on top of everything thanks to my radar. As you can see here, Hurricane Milton is hitting us pretty hard right now, but thanks to my radar I was able to track this thing in real time and prepare the entire family. This keeps us prepared and informs us of potential threats. Which is really important in these kinds of situations. Because information is what saves lives. This app has been a lifesaver, keeping me informed of any potential threats as the storm passes through. Here is a look at Milton's path. My radar showed us the storm's trajectory well in advance, giving us plenty of time to prepare, making the launch stream happen, plus being able to track the Starship as well. It's the same tool we use to track weather risks for our 24/7 cameras and the Y-team at Starbase. With my radar, we tracked the weather leading up to the launch and the clear skies that follow. It's incredible how much preparation goes into launching a Starship and preparing for a hurricane, or in our case, preparing for both at the same time. I'm so done with this. Track storms, set up custom alerts, monitor wildfires, and track orbital objects and satellite passes, or my favorite, tracking Mars rovers. So whether you're watching rocket launches or tracking severe weather, my radar has you covered. Head to the link in the description to download it for free and stay informed about whatever's coming your way. It's free, man, it's free. Download. Let's rewind the clock and focus on the ship after hot staging this time. While Booster 12 guided itself in for landing, the ship was hard at work, burning all 6 of its engines on its way to orbit. Or at least, in the case of these early test flights, a suborbital trajectory. The previous 2 flights made it through this burn flawlessly, and now SpaceX has proven that those weren't just luck. After 8.5 minutes, the ship finally cut its engines on its final near-orbit trajectory. That makes 3 successful ascents in a row. As an interesting note, to launch the most important and valuable missions for NASA, such as the James Webb Space Telescope or Europa Clipper, NASA requires 3 successful launches of the rocket before it's allowed to carry them. Therefore, by that definition, SpaceX's Starship has reached a point where it could fly any payload at any time, with the only thing holding it back being SpaceX. And there's a reason they're holding it back. Starship, despite reaching what would be the end of development for any other rocket, is only getting started, just like this ship's journey was only getting started as well. Unfortunately, it appears that SpaceX is opting to skip testing of the payload bay for now. However, we'll get plenty of chances to see that in action later. It was also nice to see that the ship stayed stable, showing they were long past the days of a tumbling Starship. After about 45 minutes of floating in space with some absolutely remarkable views provided by Starlink, it was time for the final leg of this mission as Ship 30 began slamming into the atmosphere. Re-entry is arguably even more difficult than a launch, as the vehicle now needs to survive temperatures even greater than those on the surface of the sun for over 15 minutes. The first time SpaceX attempted this, on Flight 3, the ship was in a spin, exposing the unprotected side directly to the heat before it disintegrated. And the last time they tried it, on Flight 4, many parts of the ship were not adequately shielded and began to turn into molten metal, with one of the flaps holding on by what appeared to be a single thread. For this flight, SpaceX wasn't taking any chances. Shortly after Flight 4, SpaceX began the process of tearing apart this ship's entire heat shield to replace it with one twice as strong and add an ablative backup layer beneath to ensure that if a tile was lost, the ship would still survive. Similar upgrades were also made to the flap hinges, which were a major problem on the last flight. SpaceX also shared that one of their main objectives for Ship 30's flight was to land at a precise location. During the previous flight, the ship was off significantly and would not have been able to perform a landing, even if it was in one piece, as it would have been extremely off target. In reality, you can't just move the pad real quick. But before the ship got to the ground, it needed to survive re-entry. Things started to heat up quickly. It started with a low glow as the ship slammed into the thin upper atmosphere, compressing the particles in front of it and forming a thin layer of plasma. Just like on the last flight, SpaceX was able to communicate with the ship during the entire re-entry with nearly zero interruptions. Thanks again, Starlink team. This also meant we once again got a live view of the onboard cameras, which SpaceX had now placed across the entire ship, with one pointing at each flap. And when these new views were first pulled up, we saw something shocking. If you look in the camera view at the top left corner, you can see one of the ship's two forward flaps, and it appears that it has begun to melt in some areas. Now, this could be a reflection of the plasma around it, but given what I'll explain later, that seems unlikely. When compared to the previous flight at similar speed and altitude, this is actually where Ship 29 began to lose its flap as well. Fortunately, in the case of Ship 30, this does appear to be less pronounced, but we can tell that things were definitely getting toasty. And when it comes to a heat shield, once you begin to lose it, it pretty quickly goes, as the hot gases can get behind other parts of the heat shield, making the problem even worse. And it appears that's exactly what happened once again. Shortly after we saw the first signs of the plasma getting into the flap, it quickly began to disintegrate. So this was it. Once again, it looked like the ship's re-entry would hang by a thread. But these starships seem to have an incredible will to survive, as somehow, just like on Flight 4, this flap was still fully operational. How? Just how? The flaps weren't the only areas that appeared to be having problems. Across the whole ship, sparks could clearly be seen flying off. If this were a normal ablative heat shield like on a Crew Dragon, it would be standard. However, this heat shield is supposed to be reusable, and the amount of material we saw flying off means something was going wrong. The heat shield needs more work. With the ship slowing down and cooling rapidly, things started to look good for another landing attempt. And then it happened. The three center engines ignited again, flipping the ship over and slowing it down just before touchdown. It appears that the engines were again undamaged and the flaps worked well enough to flip the ship back into an upright position. It quickly slowed down, and then they did it again. And this time they were much more accurate. Musk quickly posted that the ship had made a precise landing on target. Thanks to that, this time we got some views from a buoy that SpaceX had placed out there, similar to what they did for the booster during Flight 4. And unlike for Booster 11, this time they let it roll, showing us the ship tipping over before boom. Unfortunately, it doesn't appear SpaceX will be able to recover anything from this ship unless they decide to go on another fishing trip, but we'll have to see. Either way, this re-entry has shown that SpaceX can precisely land the ship at a given point, meaning all they need to do now is figure out the heat shield. Fortunately for them, they may have already solved the main issue. Looking at the re-entry, it appeared only the forward flaps were having issues around the hinges, while the aft flaps stayed fairly calm. This is important because these flaps have been moved on the Block 2 ships. The forward flap hinges that have been causing all of these problems are no longer in the plasma flow during re-entry. This means that SpaceX's main problem has already been solved. Depending on how the rest of the heat shield held up, we'll see what SpaceX decides to do for Flight 6. Either way, this re-entry paved the way for the future, and the future is much closer than you may realize. In fact, shortly after this flight received its launch license, NASA Spaceflight asked about some of the wording of this launch license, specifically how vague it was regarding which flight it was for. And their response surprised most of us. They stated that the license that SpaceX used to launch Flight 5 also includes approval for Flight 6's mission profile. That means SpaceX won't need regulatory approval for the next launch. They can launch the moment the hardware is ready. Yes! This means no more pending regulatory approval. Because this flight went so well, SpaceX is likely to fly a very similar profile to Flight 6, just with an updated heat shield for Ship 31. So there's a good chance we'll see yet another Starship launch towards the end of the year, maybe even late November. That finally is it for today. Remember to smash the like button, subscribe for more. This is what fuels the algorithm, and this is how you can help us for free. Check out our epic shirts in your favorite Space Nerd store. A new Raptor design and our epic Flight 5 design are both up. Grab an early Christmas gift. A link is in the description and in the card you should see now. And if you want to train your space IQ even further, watch this video next to continue your journey. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again in the next episode. By what it pretty goes. It quickly goes. And then it happened. I still can't believe it. And then I really can't.